Hello, and welcome back to my channel. In the years before the Civil War, the Underground Railroad was key to helping slaves find their freedom. This railroad was a network of roads and homes that slaves used to reach northern states and Canada. Michigan was a key state along this route, especially for slaves coming up from Kentucky. Before the 1850s, if escaped slaves reached a free state in the North, they could stay there and build a new life. However, there was always the fear of possibly being followed and caught by slave catchers who would then bring them back into the South and back into slavery. Adam Crosswhite was one of these such escaped slaves. Let's learn more about his story. Crosswhite was born on October 17, 1799, in Bourbon County, Kentucky. His mother was a slave and his father was a white slaveholder. At the age of 20, he worked in the home of Frances Giltner. 2 years later, he married Sarah and they had 4 children: John, Benjamin, Sarah, and Frances. In 1845, Crosswhite learned that Giltner was planning on selling members of his family, so they made the decision to escape. Using the Underground Railroad, the family made their way to Michigan and arrived successfully in August. They settled near Marshall in Calhoun County. Crosswhite quickly became a well-respected man in the area. He told his neighbors about his fears of being captured, and together they arranged for Crosswhite to fire a gun if he ever felt like he was in danger. The neighbors agreed to help if that situation warranted, but everyone hoped that that would never be necessary. Unfortunately, in late 1846, Crosswhite's past came chasing after him. Francis Troutman, the nephew of Crosswhite's former owner, arrived in Marshall. He first claimed to be a lawyer looking for work, but in reality, he was a slave catcher out of Kentucky looking for Crosswhite. With the help of Deputy Sheriff Harvey Dixon, Troutman located his prey and made plans to capture Crosswhite and bring him back to Kentucky. It's still unknown whether Dixon was bribed to help or if he was actually pro-slavery. On January 26, 1847, at 4:00 p.m., Troutman and 3 other men arrived at the Crosswhite cabin to take the family back to Kentucky. They cited the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793. Crosswhite saw them coming and fired the single warning shot from his gun to alert his neighbors, then barred the door and hoped for help to come. Troutman and his men broke down the door and tore the house apart, looking for all the children, including Henry, a boy who had been born after the family came to Michigan. But thankfully, the slave catchers were unable to find anyone. After Adam fired the signal shot, local civilians, both white and black, gathered to aid the Crosswhites. That night, they numbered between 200 and 300 people. Troutman tried to persuade the people to help him, but he was unsuccessful. When Troutman asked the names of the people who were preventing him from accomplishing his mission, the men from Marshall had no fear, and many of them shouted their names out loud. The civilian group ended up arresting the Kentucky men and brought them to Justice Randall Hobart. They were charged with breaking and entering, and Troutman was also charged with drawing his gun. During the confusion and arrest, the Crosswhites took advantage of that distraction and climbed into the wagon of George Ingersoll, who brought them to nearby Jackson. Once there, the family boarded a train for Detroit, while Ingersoll made sure they were not followed. From Detroit, they made their way to Canada. If the people of Marshall thought this altercation was at an end, they were very mistaken. This seemingly small and isolated event had a national impact. Many people in Kentucky were furious with the civilians of Marshall for helping the Crosswhites, and they took the case to court. The courts went so far as to send Commissioner Alexander McLean to Canada to interrogate Adam and Sarah Crosswhite. The civilians of Marshall were eventually charged with stealing property and, unfortunately, were eventually found guilty and made to pay a hefty fine of $1,926. The case even went further. Senator Henry Clay from Kentucky, who was a friend of Giltner, took the case all the way to the Senate. He used the Crosswhite event as an example of why he believed a stronger fugitive slave law was needed. This new law passed in 1850 and provided for the seizure and return of runaway slaves who escaped from one state into another or into a federal territory, whether slave holding or free. Despite the passage of this Fugitive Slave Act, Michigan did not back down in their views of anti-slavery. 5 years later, they passed their own law at the state level, making it illegal for state and local officials to help slave catchers find escaped slaves. Many historians cite this Fugitive Slave Act as a major cause of the American Civil War. Unfortunately, history is sketchy when it comes to what happened to the Crosswhites after this incident. Adam and Sarah settled in Chatham, Canada, after they escaped in 1847. In 1850, they moved to Elgin, which is a settlement also known as Buxton. The Buxton settlement had 9,000 acres where more than 1,200 fugitive slaves from all over the United States made a home. It is thought that the two of the Crosswhite children died shortly after the Civil War, likely from typhoid when an epidemic swept through the settlement. The couple eventually returned to Marshall, where they lived out the rest of their lives. Adam died on January 23, 1878, and Sarah died in 1887. Information on the children is limited, but it appears that Benjamin Franklin Crosswhite died on February 22, 1912, in Michigan, and Henry may have fought in the Civil War with the United States colored troops. It has also been recorded that the Crosswhite daughter, Sarah, married and had 8 children of her own. The antebellum period of the Civil War really is a fascinating time period. There were so many changes going on in our country, both good and bad. And Michigan, being a part of the Underground Railroad and the many anti-slavery citizens willing to help their fellow man, can be a source of pride for our state. Families like the Crosswhites, who simply wanted to live their lives free and peacefully, were able to benefit from the tenacity of our early citizens and their efforts to help eradicate slavery, not only through the Underground Railroad, but then also through their own beliefs. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.